Good morning, Nerd Fighters. I need a favor. So the project for Awesome was about 8 months ago, and some of my friends and I donated enough money to get our own Vlogbrothers video. Hank and John have yet to deliver, presumably because they've been too busy doing more important things, like distributing the money to charity, or making insightful videos about healthcare and the legacy of wealth, or finishing an original web series, or watching their novel get made into a movie, or playing at Carnegie Hall, or helping bring new life into the world, or whatever. Anyway, since Hank and John are so busy, I was sort of wondering if you could do it for me instead. So the video I wanted the Vlogbrothers to make was itself sort of like a P4A video, with the distinction that I'm not asking for money. I'm just asking you to talk about something. This is kind of nice, because with like war or cancer or practically any issue, it is really, really hard to fix it, but it is really, really easy to say, yes, that is a bad thing, I do not like it. Lately, it seems like the entire country has been embroiled in an ugly fight about rape, like whether some kinds of rape are gray rape, as opposed to other kinds of rape which are more legitimate, or if there are a lot of false rape accusations, or if sometimes there might be blurred lines of consent, or a million of other things that make people fight a lot and yell at each other, which I find very scary. Luckily, I'm not really interested in arguing in this debate, because I think it ends up leaving a lot of people out. I think that in arguing about whether or not something counts as rape, we forget that rapes are not the majority of cases of sexual violence. According to the Centers for Disease Control, other forms of sexual violence are actually over twice as common as rape. In fact, the most common category of sexual violence is something called non-contact unwanted sexual experiences, which doesn't involve any touching at all, and which has happened to about 23% of Americans despite the fact that nobody has ever heard of it. The CDC lists examples like someone flashing someone else or masturbating in front of them, making someone show their sexual body parts, making them watch or participate in sexual photos or movies, or harassing them in a public place in a way that made them feel unsafe. I realize that, compared to rape, something called non-contact unwanted sexual experiences might not seem like that big of a deal. But first of all, I am making this video in response to someone who once talked to the President of the United States about pennies. And second of all, imagine if you stepped on a Lego, and your friends saw you jumping up and down and swearing, and they responded by saying, "Meh, it's not that big of a deal, at least you weren't raped." People probably wouldn't do that, because stepping on a Lego doesn't really invite the comparison to rape. But arguably, the fact that non-contact unwanted sexual experiences invite a comparison to rape is actually a reason to take them more seriously, and not a reason to dismiss them. I mean, if we think it's a good idea to rank all emotional experiences in terms of our personal perceptions of how they compare to traumatic situations, why don't we just respond to things like divorce or the loss of a parent with, well, at least you weren't in the Holocaust? Maybe we don't do that because it would be terrible and not at all helpful, and also because any happiness that can be derived from not personally being in the Holocaust feels weird and hollow inside. To me, using trauma to dismiss fear and pain does not feel like a way of supporting survivors of that trauma. It feels like a way of reinforcing the trauma by saying that it's impossible to ever be happy or normal again. It reminds me of in The Fault in Our Stars, when Hazel talks about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is this thing that says that you have to feel healthy and safe before you care about love and respect and morality and all those things that kind of make us human. Hazel says, "The urge to make art or contemplate philosophy does not go away when you are sick. Those urges just become transfigured by illness." End quote. I believe that people who have been through trauma still care about supposedly lesser tragedies. Sadly, there are some survivors of real rape who do feel numb to lesser tragedies. But those lesser tragedies aren't just things like gray rape or non-contact abuse. There are some survivors of sadistic abuse who have trouble understanding the trauma of child abuse that doesn't involve torture. That's something we should mourn, and not something we should try to recreate, especially because many survivors do have PTSD that makes hearing about lesser tragedies even worse for them. If we're really interested in helping rape survivors, it's best to try to prevent rape and help them feel safe by taking even small forms of sexual violence seriously. I said before that 23% of Americans have experienced non-contact abuse. It's a pretty broad category. I'm guessing that some of those people have moved on or weren't really all that bothered by it in the first place. But some of those people are probably still dealing with the trauma. Maybe it happened when they were young. Maybe their abuser was someone they really loved and trusted. Maybe the abuse was ongoing. Maybe it reminded them of something in their past. Maybe they were videotaped against their will and the tapes were distributed. Maybe, when it was happening, they were terrified and didn't know what was going to happen. Or maybe they were just traumatized, which would be a perfectly normal reaction, because what happened to them was abuse. And because non-contact abuse is more common than rape. There are probably a lot of people out there who have experienced non-contact abuse, but haven't been raped and who have no words to give to their experience. LaToya Peterson once said, speaking of herself and her friends as teenagers, "We learned a lot about rape. What we were not prepared for was everything else. Rape was something we could identify, and act with a strict definition and two distinct scenarios. Not rape was something else entirely." End quote. She went on to say, At age 14, I lacked the words to speak my experience into reality. Without those words, I was rendered silent and impotent, burdened with the knowledge of what did not happen, but unable to free myself by talking about what did happen. I cannot change the experiences of the past, but I can teach these words." End quote. She was speaking about sexual assault. I would like to offer some new words, the words non-contact abuse. I think it would be a safer world if we all had this phrase in our vocabulary. If you would like to, you can make your own video in response using these words. You can talk about your own experiences, or your thoughts, or just say anything you want to say. Now I'd like to share a story. This is not a story about rape, or sexual assault, or even non-contact abuse. In fact, if we're going by how the questions the CDC uses to determine the prevalence of sexual violence in the US, this is definitively not sexual violence at all. It's from the end of The Catcher in the Rye, so if you haven't read it, please stop watching. Toward the end of the book, there's a scene where Holden Caulfield is afraid one of his old teachers is trying to make a pass at him. It's a famously ambiguous scene, because Holden's an unreliable narrator, and Mr. Antolini is a pretty great guy with some of the wisest lines in the novel. Mr. Antolini has Holden over at his house. He tells him, "Good night, handsome," and forgets to lend him pajamas, which means Holden is sleeping in his underwear. Later, Holden wakes up to find Mr. Antolini patting his head. It scares Holden, and he leaves, but later he wonders if he might have overreacted. I'm not sure how J.D. Salinger meant this scene, and if there were a court case, there really wouldn't be enough evidence to decide what Mr. Antolini was trying to do to Holden. But in the same way that books belong to their readers, this experience belongs to Holden Caulfield. He gets to decide how it should make him feel. In fact, he has to, because how he decides that question determines how he should react. And it's pretty likely that how he interprets this situation will be different from how Mr. Antolini interpreted it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Mr. Antolini's interpretation is more real or more valid than Holden's, and Mr. Antolini reacts as if his interpretation is more real and more valid. When Holden asks him what the hell he's doing, he says, "Nothing, I'm simply sitting here admiring." When Holden continues to express that he's upset, Mr. Antolini tells him to keep his voice down, asks him, "What's the matter with you?" tells him, "Don't be ridiculous," and repeatedly calls him a very, very strange boy. I don't think there's anything particularly strange about not wanting someone to touch you while you're asleep and in your underwear. Whether Mr. Antolini intended it as a fatherly gesture or not, that's a perfectly reasonable boundary, and Holden has the right to set that boundary. Mr. Antolini could have responded by apologizing for scaring him, but instead he responds by dismissing Holden's feelings. That doesn't necessarily mean Mr. Antolini was planning to molest Holden. It also doesn't negate all the great things Mr. Antolini has done in his life. It just means that he crossed a boundary, maybe by accident, and didn't own up to it when confronted. Whether you think he should face any consequences for it or not, Holden does face consequences for it. He says, "I don't even like to talk about it," and it made him lose a trusted mentor in his life. Holden's experience is real, and his feeling of confusion about what was going on is scary in its own right. In fact, I would argue that this scene depicts pretty well what abuse is like. In a relationship with a manipulative person, you're often never quite sure what's going to happen, what exactly you're consenting to, or what you think you deserve. A strict definition and two distinct scenarios doesn't work very well for understanding sexual violence in such a confusing environment. That might be necessary for the law, but on a more personal level, I hope we can still give support to people who've lived through more ambiguous situations. Nobody should ever have to look back on a sexual experience and feel like they're not sure if it was abuse or not.